Hello and welcome to our Historical Sketches show. This year, 2014, and for a few weeks, Scotland has risen from the depth of unconcern and incuriosity to the surface of media interest, due, of course, to the referendum for independence. Independence that, as you know, was rejected, and not without massive propaganda and public relations efforts to dissuade the Scots from such a rash idea. But we are not here to discuss the rationale or the results of the referendum. Rather, it is an occasion to cast a glance at the history of this nation within a nation, and of a very congenial people. I don't know about you, but just hearing a Scot speaking English with his broad burr and unmistakable twang is enough to put me in a good humor. It is impossible, of course, to cover the history of a people in less than half an hour. The intent here, however, is merely to touch on some of the key milestones that contributed to broadly differentiate Scotland from England in language and character traits. But also, if we have time, to find out why, for example, Scotland has had historically a unique attitude of friendship towards France, curiously in contrast with the historical rivalry sanctioned by tradition between England and France. A rivalry whose origins we can assign to the time when the Normans in France conquered England in 1066, and when the subsequent kings of England insisted in retaining their possessions in France as English possessions rather than French land. Now, right in the heart of Paris, there is a famous bookshop called Shakespeare and Company, which is a traditional meeting point for book lovers and expatriate writers, including famous pens. And in the bookshop, I struck once a conversation with a Scot, and I asked him how long had he been in Paris. And so he said, 30 years, he said. And so I told him, do you like to live in Paris? And he said, I wouldn't like to live anywhere else. Minor anecdotal confirmation of a certain cultural affinity between the two countries. As Shakespeare himself said, there is a history in all men's lives, figuring the nature of the times deceased, the which observed a man may prophesy, etc., may prophesy the main chance of things to come at large. Now, if there is a history in all men's lives, then there is, of course, a history in the lives of every country. And the histories of most countries begin usually with a myth. And according to some medieval chronicles of Scotland, the Scots are direct descendants of the daughter of an Egyptian pharaoh. Or alternatively, another myth, Scotland was colonized by a nephew of Aeneas after he and his comrades escaped from what is today Turkey after the fall of Troy at the hand of the Greeks of Achilles. Now, as you may know, there is a schematic distinction between the inhabitants of the north of Scotland, called the Highlanders, and those residing closer to the English border, called the Lowlanders. And this somewhat reductive subdivision is a reflection of an early division between the colonized areas of the British Isles, colonized by the Romans, a division between what was Scotland, what was England, and what was beyond. The division was marked by a wall whose remnants are still there today, the famous Hadrian Wall, and now a popular path for tourists who like to walk and who like history. As the name implies, it was the Emperor Hadrian who began the fortification in the year 122 AD with the purpose of keeping out, or in, depending on how you look at it, with the purpose of keeping out the original Scots, who were actually called Picts, from the Latin adjective picti, meaning painted, because indeed the Picts like to paint their bodies. And in the pictures that I show you here, there is a stone preserved with a preserved Pict inscription. The area north of the wall was called Caledonia, which was indeed the name given to Scotland by the Romans, and today it remains as a kind of poetic name for Scotland as a whole, just as Hibernia is named for Ireland and Britannia for Britain. But there were not only Picts inhabiting north of the wall, there were also the first Scots by the name, the Scots of Dalriada, who were actually Irish immigrants. They found an ideal habitat in the southwest of Scotland, in the region today called Argyll, and of which you can see one of the castles here. Along with the Picts and the Scots, there were also the Bretons, whose lands bordered by the Angli or English were bordered by the Angli or English, who, however, were actually Germans. And I know this is all very confusing, but it is not the fault of the historians. In a previous episode, we showed that the original French were actually Germans, or rather a barbarian German tribe, out of which came eventually the Emperor Charlemagne. And it was chance that allowed the transformation of the German French into the proper French, and the development of the Germans on the other side of the River Rhine as proper Germans or Saxons. Therefore, it should be no surprise if the original Angli were an offshoot of the original Germans. But back to Scotland, where the culture of the Picts was in part incorporated into that of the Scots of Dalriada, with the adoption of the Celtic idiom. They were converted to Christianity, according to tradition, by the famous Irish Saint Columba, who was a Celtic monk. But the event that triggered the division of Scotland into Highlands and Lowlands occurred actually in the year 685 AD, when the Angli of the northern English region of Northumbria attempted to invade Scotland, but were stopped in the Battle of Danichen, shown in this Pict symbol stone, after which the Highlanders, we could say, consolidated their Celtic ways, whereas the culture of the Lowlanders had more affinity with the Angli. This difference of cultures gave rise to what we call a mutual disdain, so much so that up to the 1800s, the Lowlanders called the Highlanders savages, whereas the Highlanders called the Lowlanders Sassenach, or Saxons, meaning that they spoke a language with German roots. Now, in the High Middle Ages, the integration of the people who lived in the Highlands was facilitated by intermarriages, and in 841 AD, a Pict woman married the Scot king Mac Alpin, and under his rule, the two main people of Scotland, the Picts and the Scots of Dalriada, were unified into one kingdom called Scotia or Scotia. Complete integration was still tentative, but in the meantime, in the 9th century, there loomed at the horizon the Viking invasions, and the two archipelagos north of Scotland, the Orkneys and the Shetlands, became de facto Scandinavian colonies. Eventually, all traces of the original Picts were lost, and around the year 1000, Scotland began to be referred to also as Alba, a Gaelic name reflecting the predominance of the Celtic and Scot elements in the land. Now, after these Viking invasions, Scotland ended up being divided into three areas. The very north and the islands belonged to the Norwegians. The centre of Scotland, as perhaps I've already said, was the Kingdom of Alba, whereas the south, the Lothian, and the future Edinburgh was under the rule of the Anglo-Saxons. The supremacy of the Kingdom of Alba in the 11th century was checked by the expansionist objective of the English king Canute the Great. It was then in the 1040 AD that a king rose to the throne whose name is familiar worldwide, namely Macbeth, who won the throne or captured the throne via a conspiracy. But he too, Macbeth, after saying those famous lines, "Out, out, brief candle, life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that frets and struts its ways across the stage, and then is heard no more, a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing." Yeah, as I said, he, Macbeth, was killed by Malcolm III, who was nicknamed, by the way, Large Head. In turn, Malcolm III, in 1069, married Margaret, sister of Edgar Atheling, King of England, and this happened approximately at the time when William the Conqueror conquered England, and the date that most people remember, 1066. Still, Queen Margaret, English wife of a Scottish king, and who later, this lady was made a saint by the church, introduced into Scotland English ways, favouring also the ascent of English personalities to important political positions. And for the history of Scotland, this is important, because it marked the end of a tradition of life based on the ideas of the clans and consanguinity. The tradition evolved to a model of life based on the feudal customs common in England and in the rest of Europe at the time. Celtic traditions resisted in the north, but the pivot of power, as we would say today, was won in the south. However, in the year 1168, an event occurred which is the first historical original root of the curious affinity between Scotland and France, of which I spoke earlier on. The Scottish king William the Lion rebelled against the state of subjection to England, and he struck a military alliance with the King of France, which was called Louis VII, who was called Louis VII. Still, the King of Scotland was defeated, and he had to sign the Treaty of Falaise, so called by the name of the French town in whose castle, seen here, William the Lion was kept prisoner. Scotland became de facto a feudal appendage of the kings in London. But the Treaty of Falaise, however, was not permanent or perennial. The next King of England, Richard the Lionheart, whom we met in a previous episode, did not renew the pact. He was just happy to receive a large indemnity, and Scotland regained her effective independence. However, things never remain stable for long. And given that man's humor can be nothing but mutation, as Shakespeare himself would say or did say, we can rarely predict what man may be up to next. And at the end of the 1200s, the throne of Scotland became suddenly vacant, as the Scottish King Alexander III died, and so did his very young niece and heiress called Marguerite. So the arbiter as who should inherit the Scottish throne was the English King Edward I, and he chose an Anglo-Norman nobleman by the name of John Balliol. And at the beginning, Balliol proved submissive and deferent to England to the point that he acquired the nickname of Empty Jacket, which needs no explanation. But with time, he started riding the wave of popular malcontent against the English, and he too struck an alliance with the king, with the French king, the so-called Old Alliance, old as in Auld Lang Syne. The English reacted, the Scots surrendered, but the revolt was continued by a lieutenant of Balliol, and he had a name that you may recognize because Hollywood made it famous. He was William Wallace, who in 1297 won a decisive victory at Stirling Bridge. Wallace was the animator of a form of independentism, we could say, rising from the base and defined as a democratic nationalism. In fact, at the beginning of the strive for Scottish independence, the noblemen remained neutral, whereas the fighters were mainly the small property holders and the peasants. But Wallace's success did not last long. 1 year later, his army was literally massacred at the Battle of Falkirk, and he survived, but he was captured by the English seven years later, and after his decapitation, his head was exposed as a trophy on the London Bridge. But he remains a Scottish hero, celebrated by various statues and monuments throughout Scotland. The execution of William Wallace raised the indignation, however, of another Scottish nobleman whose name may be familiar to some. His name was Robert Bruce. He was also upset by the program of the English to remove all the Scottish tradition out of government. And in 1306, Robert Bruce acceded to the Scottish throne via a coup d'etat, we would say today, and eventually defeated the English army at the Battle of Bannockburn on the 24th of June of 1314. 700 or whatever, it's 600 years before the First World War. But Robert Bruce had even greater ambition. To begin with, he wanted the rest of Europe to officially recognize Scotland's independence, and to this effect, he sent a petition and a request to all the heads of Europe, including the Pope, who at the time was John the 22nd. The petition, or request, went down in history as the Declaration of Arbroath, in which declaration it is claimed, among other things, that the Scots, as I said earlier in the program, descend from an Egyptian pharaoh. Whatever the actual origins of the Scots, the national identity of Scotland was gradually, in this period was gradually forming. And just like Dante's Divine Comedy in the year 1300 sanctioned the idea of Italy and of its association, the association of Italy with the Italian language, something similar happened in Scotland. In the year 1375, John Barbour wrote a great poem called Bruce to celebrate the victor. Finally, Scotland adopted her own juridical system, independent of the English system, which was based on what was and still is called the common law. But at the end of the Middle Ages, Scottish independence was again threatened, and this time from the inside. Especially in the Highlands, the power of the old clans rose again, in particular the clans of the Campbells and the clans of the MacDonalds declared themselves the depositories of what is called the Gaelic Catholic tradition, whereas the Campbells, this was the MacDonalds, whereas the Campbells allied themselves with the Protestant bloc and therefore were pro-English. Incidentally, the current clan chief of the Campbells is the Duke of Argyll, who lives in the beautiful castle of Inverara, which you see here, and which many of you will recognize as having been featured in the serial Downton Abbey. Now, the division between the pro-Scot, pro-Catholic, and the pro-English, pro-Protestant, or rather, let me say it again, of the Scot pro-Catholic and the Scots pro-English, pro-Protestant, sharpened with the advent to the throne of the King Henry VIII. Henry had attacked France, and because of the old alliance of which we spoke earlier on, alliance between the Scots and the French, he was in conflict with the Scots as well, whom he defeated at yet another battle, the Battle of Flodden in 1513. And Henry was determined to make Protestantism prevail also in Scotland, and helped establish a strong pro-Protestant, we could say pro-Protestant party, led by another famous name familiar to some, the theologian John Knox. The Catholic reacted and found their leader in the famous Scottish Queen Mary Stuart. On the other hand, she found herself surrounded by a noble class which now was subservient to the English, and she had to fight against Protestantism, or rather Presbyterianism, which was a form of Protestant Calvinism. That we could say today it had a tinge of today's neocons of the south of the United States. Mary Stuart was married to the King of France, Francis II, but he died 2 years afterwards after the marriage, so she returned from Paris to Scotland, and where she married her first cousin, of course another Stuart, by the name of Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. But he too was murdered. It was not a very peaceful time, and following an uprising, yet another uprising, Mary Stuart was imprisoned in the castle of Lochheaven. Now, on the 24th of July, 1567, she was forced to abdicate in favor of James, her one-year-old son, by her second husband, Lord Darnley. After an unsuccessful attempt to regain the throne, she fled southwards, seeking the protection of her first cousin, once removed, Queen Elizabeth I of England. Now, Mary had previously claimed Elizabeth's throne as her own, as she considered herself the legitimate sovereign of England, and she was considered the legitimate sovereign by many English Catholics, including the participants in the rebellion, which was called the Rising of the North. Now, perceiving her as a threat, Elizabeth had her confined in various castles and manor houses in the interior of England, and after 18.5 years in custody, Mary was found guilty of plotting to assassinate Elizabeth, and as you may know from history, common history, she was subsequently executed. Mary left her vacant throne to her son, James VI, and when Queen Elizabeth first died, James VI of Scotland became King James I of England, and Scotland and Ireland, or, if you like, the King of Great Britain. His, of course, mean the King James I, the king whose name is associated with the famous King James Bible, also referred to as the Authorized Version. The translation was done, believe it or not, by 47 scholars, all of whom were members by now of the Church of England. And in common with other translations of the period, the New Testament was translated from the Greek, the Old Testament was translated from the Hebrew or Aramaic, and the apocryphal Gospels was translated again from the Greek and from the Latin. The King James Bible became the most widely printed book in history, and it remains a frame of reference for the English language, even if certain forms are now used only in churches, or perhaps to add some pointedness to irony or to speech. King James Bible was created during a period of fast linguistic change, but the translators avoided avoided contemporary idioms, using instead forms that were already slightly archaic at the time, like verily and it came to pass, and so on. The pronouns thou, thee, and you were consistently used as singular and plural, respectively, even at the time. Even Shakespeare did so, especially when addressing a social superior, calling you and not thee. Another sign of linguistic conservatism in the Bible is the invariable use of theath for the third person singular, present of the form, as example in the form, the angel of the Lord appeareth to Joseph in a dream. The rival ending es, as found in today's English, was widely used again, even at the time, and even in the plays of Shakespeare and Marlowe. And by the 19th century, a noteworthy theologian could say of the King James Bible, it lives on the ear like the music that can never be forgotten, like the sound of church bells, with the convert hardly knows how he can forgo. The union of Scotland and England was formally enshrined in the Act of the Union of 1707, union that the recent referendum did not succeed in rescinding. And historically speaking, it is quite remarkable that the King of Scotland, whose mother was killed by the Queen of England, became the King of England in Scotland, as well as a symbol of the Protestant religion fought against by his mother, who was Catholic. But in history, as in life, almost everything is possible, which justifies Oscar Wilde's assertion, I believe anything, provided it is quite incredible. And this is the end of our historical sketch, and I will thank the crew, and in particular always our very skilled director, Kat Iverson. Thank you for watching, and see you next time. I am Jimmy for Historical Sketches.